That evening at the prestigious Music Awards ceremony, renowned classical music critic Jonathan Sterling stood up and publicly declared that Ozzy Osbourne represents everything wrong with modern music. He had no idea that within hours, the Prince of Darkness would completely shatter his worldview and change his life forever. But when Sterling made those dismissive words, there was a man sitting quietly in the back of the hall, listening in silence. That man was Ozzy Osbourne himself, and nothing in Sterling's life would ever be the same again. Because sometimes the greatest lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. The crystal chandeliers of the Royal Albert Hall cast their golden light across an audience filled with the most distinguished figures in the music industry. The annual British Music Heritage Awards brought together classical virtuosos, opera singers, and music academics who considered themselves the guardians of real musical culture. Among them sat Jonathan Sterling, a man whose pen had the power to make or break careers in the classical music world. Sterling adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and straightened his perfectly pressed bow tie as he prepared for his moment. At 62, he had built his reputation on unwavering standards and his fierce protection of what he called musical integrity. His reviews in the Classical Review were read by millions, and his opinions could determine which young musicians received scholarships and which concert halls would book emerging artists. Tonight, however, Sterling had come with a mission. For months, he had watched in horror as heavy metal music gained mainstream acceptance. Award shows were beginning to include rock categories, and worst of all, some educational institutions were actually teaching courses on popular music. This trend, in Sterling's view, was nothing short of cultural destruction. As the evening progressed through various classical performances, Sterling grew increasingly agitated. The applause for a beautiful violin concerto seemed lukewarm compared to the screaming crowds he'd seen on television at rock concerts. The refined appreciation of a Mozart symphony felt overshadowed by the commercial success of what he considered musical garbage. When the ceremony reached its midpoint, Sterling could contain himself no longer. During a brief intermission, he stood up from his prominent seat in the third row and requested permission to address the audience. The event organizers, recognizing his influence in the classical world, reluctantly agreed to give him a few minutes at the microphone. Sterling approached the podium with the confidence of a man who had never been wrong about music in his entire career. His voice carried clearly through the grand hall as he began what he intended to be a rallying cry for musical civilization. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling began, his voice carrying the authority of decades in classical music criticism, "we are living through a cultural crisis. The sacred art of music, which has elevated human consciousness for centuries, is under attack by charlatans and noisemakers who call themselves musicians." The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was supposed to be a celebration, not a lecture, but Sterling's reputation commanded attention. "I speak specifically," Sterling continued, his voice rising with passion, "of the degradation represented by so-called heavy metal music. And if I may name the worst offender, the man who represents everything wrong with modern music, Ozzy Osbourne." A murmur ran through the audience. Even in this refined gathering, most people knew who Ozzy Osbourne was, though few would admit to listening to his music. Sterling pressed on, unaware that he was about to seal his own fate. "This man has spent decades polluting the airwaves with noise that bears no resemblance to music. He has corrupted the minds of young people, turning them away from the beauty of Mozart, Beethoven, and Bach. His very existence is an insult to every serious musician who has ever lived." The critic paused for dramatic effect, scanning the audience for signs of agreement. "We must take a stand against this cultural vandalism. We must refuse to legitimize noise as music. We must protect the sacred traditions that have guided human artistic expression for centuries." As Sterling concluded his speech and returned to his seat, amid polite but uncomfortable applause, he felt satisfied with his bold statement. He had drawn a line in the sand between real music and commercial noise. What he didn't know was that in the back corner of the hall, partially hidden by shadows, sat a man in a simple black jacket who had heard every word. After the ceremony concluded, Sterling lingered in the lobby, accepting congratulations from fellow classical music enthusiasts who appreciated his brave stance against popular music. He was discussing the declining standards of music education with a group of conservatory professors when a hotel staff member approached him.
"Excuse me, Mr. Sterling," the young woman said hesitantly. "There's a gentleman in the hotel restaurant who would like to speak with you. He said he heard your speech tonight and was very interested in your perspective."
Sterling assumed it was another classical music supporter, perhaps perhaps a wealthy patron looking to fund an organization dedicated to preserving musical traditions. He made his way to the elegant hotel restaurant, expecting to find a distinguished gentleman in formal attire, waiting to discuss the evening's events. Instead, he found a man sitting alone at a corner table, dressed in dark clothing, with long graying hair and distinctive round glasses. The man looked up as Sterling approached, and the critic felt his blood run cold as he recognized the face he had seen countless times in newspapers and magazines, usually accompanied by headlines about controversy or scandal. It was Ozzy Osbourne. Sterling's first instinct was to turn and leave, but something in Ozzy's calm demeanor made him pause. The rock star gestured to the empty chair across from him with a gentle smile that seemed completely at odds with his fearsome reputation. "Mr. Sterling," Ozzy said in his distinctive Birmingham accent, his voice surprisingly soft, "would you mind joining me for a cup of tea? I believe we have some things to discuss." Sterling found himself sitting down before he had consciously decided to do so. His mind raced with confusion and a touch of fear. What did this man want with him? Was this some kind of confrontation? He had heard stories about rock stars and their volatile tempers. Ozzy poured tea from an elegant china service with surprising grace, his movements deliberate and calm. "I heard your speech tonight," he said simply, every word of it. Sterling's throat went dry. "I was simply expressing my professional opinion about the state of modern music." "Oh, I know exactly what you were doing," Ozzy replied, still smiling. "You were defending something you love deeply. I respect that, Mr. Sterling. I truly do." What happened next would haunt Sterling's memories for the rest of his life. Instead of anger or confrontation, Ozzy began to speak about his own life with a honesty and vulnerability that the critic had never expected. "You know, Mr. Sterling," Ozzy began, cradling his teacup in both hands, "I grew up in Birmingham, in the Aston area. My dad worked at a steel factory, came home every night with his hands cut up and his back aching. My mum cleaned houses for families who had grand pianos in their parlors, pianos that I could only dream of touching." Sterling listened in silence, unsure where this conversation was heading. "I was born with dyslexia, had a terrible stutter, and left school at 15 because my family needed money," Ozzy continued. "My first job was in a slaughterhouse, killing animals every day just to survive. But you know what saved me, Mr. Sterling? Music." The rock star's eyes took on a distant look as he remembered his youth. "Not the noise you think I make, but real music. The first song that ever moved me to tears was Danny Boy, sung by my grandmother. The first time I felt the power of harmony was in a church choir. The first time I understood that music could tell a story was listening to folk ballads my mother hummed while she worked." Sterling found himself leaning forward, drawn into the narrative despite himself. "When Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, Bill Ward and I formed Black Sabbath, we weren't trying to destroy music," Ozzy explained. "We were trying to create something that spoke to people like us, working class kids who felt lost and forgotten. We were telling our stories the only way we knew how." The critic's carefully constructed worldview began to crack as Ozzy continued his story. "You mentioned Mozart in your speech," Ozzy said with genuine reverence. "Do you know that I've spent hours studying his Requiem? The way he channeled his own mortality into those notes? That's exactly what I try to do in my music, Mr. Sterling. I'm dealing with the same human emotions: fear, loss, hope, desperation, just in a different language." Sterling sat in stunned silence as Ozzy pulled out his phone and played a recording. But instead of the harsh metal sounds the critic expected, he heard a beautiful, haunting melody played on acoustic guitar. "This is the foundation of Mama, I'm Coming Home," Ozzy explained. "I wrote it when Sharon was diagnosed with cancer. It's built on a classical chord progression that Bach himself might have used. The difference is I added distortion and drums because that's the only way I know how to express the raw pain of thinking you might lose the person you love most." For the first time in their conversation, Sterling spoke up. I had no idea." "Of course you didn't," Ozzy replied gently, "because you never listened past the surface. You heard the volume, the energy, the rebellion, and you assumed there was nothing deeper. But let me ask you something, Mr. Sterling. When Beethoven wrote his Fifth Symphony, wasn't he rebelling against the musical conventions of his time? When Wagner created his operas, wasn't he pushing boundaries that made conservative critics uncomfortable?" Sterling felt his face flush. The comparison seemed almost blasphemous, yet he couldn't immediately refute the logic. Ozzy continued, his voice growing more passionate, but never losing its gentle tone. "You said I've corrupted young people, turned them away from beauty, but I've received thousands of letters from fans telling me that my music music saved their lives. Kids who were considering suicide, who felt so alone and lost that they couldn't see any reason to continue living, found hope in songs like Shot in the Dark and Dreamer. The rock star's eyes filled with emotion as he spoke. There's a young man named Marcus in Detroit who told me that Iron Man helped him overcome a drug addiction because he finally felt understood. A girl named Sarah in Manchester said that changes gave her the courage to leave an abusive relationship. Are their lives worth less than a concert hall full of classical music lovers, Mr. Sterling? Sterling felt something fundamental shifting inside him as Ozzy's words sank in. For the first time in his career, he was being forced to confront the possibility that his rigid definitions of musical worth might be incomplete. But the technique, Sterling protested weakly. The musical sophistication. Ozzy smiled and began to hum a melody. Sterling recognized it immediately. It was the opening theme from Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 11. I learned to play that when I was in my 40s, Ozzy said. Took me 3 years of lessons, practicing every day when I wasn't touring. My teacher was amazed at how quickly I picked up the emotional content, even when my technical skills were still developing. You see, Mr. Sterling, I've always understood music. I just express it differently than you do. The rock star leaned forward, his expression earnest. I'm not asking you to like my music. I'm not even asking you to respect it. But I am asking you to consider that maybe, just maybe, there's more than one way to touch a human soul with sound. Sterling sat in silence for several long minutes, his mind reeling. Everything he had built his career on, the certainty that classical music was inherently superior, the belief that technical training was the only path to musical legitimacy, the conviction that popular music was destroying culture, was crumbling before his eyes. You mentioned Beethoven, Sterling said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. He was deaf when he wrote some of his greatest works. He couldn't hear the technical perfection you're talking about. He could only feel the emotion. Ozzy nodded. Exactly. And that's what music really is, isn't it? It's not about the complexity of the arrangement or the precision of the performance. It's about one human being reaching out to another and saying, "You're not alone. I understand what you're feeling." As the evening wore on, Sterling found himself sharing his own story with this man he had publicly denounced just hours earlier. He talked about his childhood in rural Wales, where his working-class parents had scraped together money for piano lessons because they believed music could give their son a better life. He spoke about the pressure he felt to maintain standards, to protect the musical traditions that had shaped his identity. I think I understand something now, Sterling admitted. I've been so afraid of losing the music I love that I couldn't see the value in music I didn't understand. Ozzy reached across the table and placed a gentle hand on Sterling's shoulder. Music isn't a finite resource, my friend. Appreciating one kind doesn't mean you have to destroy another. The world is big enough for Mozart and Black Sabbath, for opera and heavy metal, for conservatory training and raw passion. Sterling felt tears forming in his eyes as he realized the depth of his misunderstanding. All those young musicians I discouraged, all those artists I dismissed, what have I done? You've been human, Ozzy replied simply. You've made mistakes based on fear and misunderstanding. But the beautiful thing about life is that it's never too late to change course. The two men sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Ozzy spoke again. Would you like to hear something, Mr. Sterling? Something that might change your perspective even more? Sterling nodded, no longer sure what to expect from this extraordinary evening. Ozzy pulled out a small recording device and played a track that Sterling had never heard before. It began with a simple acoustic guitar melody, beautiful and haunting. Then Ozzy's voice joined in, singing with such raw emotion that Sterling felt tears streaming down his face. The song was about a father watching his daughter grow up, knowing that someday she would leave him behind. It spoke of love and loss, of the bittersweet nature of watching someone you adore become independent. The melody was sophisticated, the lyrics poetic, and the emotion absolutely genuine. When the song ended, Sterling sat in stunned silence. That's from my upcoming album, Ozzy explained. It's called Ordinary Man, and it's about my relationship with my daughter, Amy. I wrote it sitting at the piano in my home studio, thinking about Mozart's relationship with his own children. The melody came to me while I was listening to his piano concerto No. 20. Sterling stared at the man across from him, seeing him clearly for the first time. This wasn't the cultural vandal he had imagined. This was a musician, a father, a human being who expressed himself through his art just as surely as any classical composer ever had. The rock and roll, the heavy metal, Sterling said slowly, that's just one facet of who you are as an artist. Exactly, Ozzy confirmed. Just like your love for classical music is one facet of who you are as a person. Neither of us is wrong, Mr. Sterling. We're just different parts of the same magnificent, chaotic, beautiful thing called human expression. As the clock neared midnight, Sterling knew that this conversation had fundamentally changed him. The man he had been when he entered the restaurant, rigid, judgmental, certain of his superiority, no longer existed. Mr. Osbourne, he said formally, then caught himself. Ozzy, I owe you an apology. Not just for tonight's speech, but for years of dismissing something I never took the time to understand. Ozzy waved his hand dismissively. No apology necessary, mate. You were protecting something you love. I respect that passion, even when it's misdirected. But I was wrong, Sterling insisted. And more than that, I was harmful. My reviews, my influence, I've probably damaged careers, discouraged young artists, perpetuated a kind of musical segregation that serves no one. Then fix it, Ozzy said simply. Use your platform to build bridges instead of walls. Help people understand that music is music, regardless of the style or the instrument or the venue. Sterling nodded, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. You're right. I know exactly what I need to do. As they prepared to leave, Ozzy made one final offer that would cement their unlikely friendship. I'm doing a special acoustic concert next month for a charity that provides music therapy for children with cancer, he said. It's going to be very different from my usual shows. Just me, a piano, and some of the most beautiful songs I've ever written. Would you consider being my guest? Maybe write about it for your magazine? Sterling didn't hesitate. I would be honored. 3 weeks later, the Classical Review published an article that sent shockwaves through the music establishment, titled, "The Night I Learned to Listen, A Classical Critic's Journey into the Heart of Heavy Metal." Sterling's piece was unlike anything he had ever written. In it, he detailed his encounter with Ozzy Osbourne and the profound impact it had on his understanding of music. He wrote about the artificial barriers that had been constructed between different musical genres and the damage those barriers had done to musical appreciation as a whole. I have spent my career building walls, Sterling wrote, when I should have been building bridges. Music is not a competition between styles or traditions. It is a conversation between human souls, and every voice in that conversation has value. The article created an immediate controversy. Conservative classical music enthusiasts accused Sterling of selling out and abandoning his principles. Progressive music educators praised him for his courage and open-mindedness. Musicians from both classical and popular genres reached out to thank him for his honesty. But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. Ozzy Osbourne himself called Sterling to express his gratitude. "You've done something really brave," Ozzy told him. "You've admitted you were wrong, and you've used your platform to make things better. That takes real character, mate." The acoustic concert that Ozzy had mentioned turned out to be one of the most beautiful musical events Sterling had ever attended. Held in an intimate venue with just 200 seats, it featured Ozzy performing stripped-down versions of his most famous songs, alongside covers of classical pieces and traditional folk ballads. Sterling watched in amazement as Ozzy transformed Crazy Train into a haunting piano ballad that spoke of mental illness and the search for stability. He listened with tears in his eyes as the rock star performed a heartbreaking version of "Mama, I'm Coming Home" that revealed the song's core message of love and longing. But the moment that moved Sterling most was when Ozzy performed his cover of "Danny Boy," the song he had mentioned during their first conversation. Accompanied only by a simple guitar, Ozzy's voice carried all the pain and beauty of the traditional Irish melody, while adding his own unique emotional interpretation. In the audience, Sterling noticed something remarkable. The crowd was diverse in a way he had never seen at a classical concert. Young and old, formally dressed and casually attired, classical music lovers and rock fans all sat together, united in their appreciation for the beauty they were witnessing. After the concert, Sterling approached Ozzy backstage. "That was extraordinary," he said simply. "You've shown me that music truly is a universal language." Ozzy smiled and embraced the critic warmly. "No, mate, you showed yourself. I just helped you listen." In the months that followed, Sterling's perspective on music continued to evolve. He began attending rock concerts and jazz performances, approaching each with the same open mind and analytical ear he had always brought to classical music. His reviews became more nuanced, more generous, and more insightful. He started writing about the connections between different musical genres, pointing out how metal bands used harmonic progressions borrowed from classical composers, how hip-hop artists sampled jazz legends, how folk musicians influenced rock stars. His work became a bridge between musical communities that had never communicated before. Young musicians who had been dismissed by classical establishments began reaching out to Sterling for guidance. He became a mentor to artists who were trying to blend different styles, helping them understand both the technical and emotional aspects of their craft. The friendship between Sterling and Ozzy deepened over time. They would meet regularly for tea and conversation, discussing everything from music theory to philosophy to the challenges of maintaining artistic integrity in a commercial world. "You know what I've learned from all this?" Sterling told Ozzy during one of their meetings. "The greatest artists have always been the ones who broke down barriers, not the ones who built them up." Ozzy nodded in agreement. "And the greatest critics are the ones who help people understand art, not the ones who tell them what they're not allowed to like." Years later, when Sterling was asked to give the keynote address at a major music education conference, he chose to tell the story of his encounter with Ozzy Osbourne. His speech, titled "The Teacher I Never Expected," became legendary in music education circles. "I learned more about music in one evening with Ozzy Osbourne than I had in the previous decade of my career," Sterling told the audience. "Not because he taught me new techniques or introduced me to new composers, but because he reminded me what music is really about: human connection, emotional truth, and the courage to express what's in your heart." He concluded his speech with a challenge to the educators in the audience. "Don't just teach your students about music. Teach them to listen, really listen, to everything. Because the moment you decide that one form of human expression is invalid, you close yourself off from a universe of beauty and truth." The standing ovation that followed was not just for Sterling's words, but for the journey he had taken from rigid judgment to open-minded appreciation. As for Ozzy, he continued to create music that defied easy categorization, always pushing boundaries and challenging expectations. But he also took on a new role as an ambassador between different musical communities, helping classical musicians understand the value of popular music and showing rock fans the beauty of classical traditions. The story of their unlikely friendship became a symbol of hope in a world too often divided by artificial boundaries. It showed that understanding and respect could triumph over prejudice and fear, that the greatest teachers sometimes come in the most unexpected packages, and that music truly is a universal language that can unite even the most unlikely souls. In the end, both men were transformed by their encounter. Sterling became a more complete critic and a more compassionate human being. Ozzy discovered new depths in his own artistry and found an unexpected friendship that enriched his life in countless ways. Their story continues to inspire musicians, critics, and music lovers around the world, reminding everyone that the greatest magic happens when we have the courage to listen with open hearts and minds to voices we might never have expected to hear.